Where does Thomas stand in the vexed question of the relationship between the sacerdotium and the imperium? He believes that the temporal power is subject to the spiritual power, in the same way that the body is subject to the soul. He writes, "Therefore, there is no usurpation of power if a spiritual prelate should interest himself in temporal affairs with respect to those things in which the temporal power is subject to him, or in matters which have been left to him by the secular power." Thomas seems to recognize distinct spheres of authority. He writes, "Just as it falls to temporal princes to enact legal precepts which are particular determinations of the natural law, in all those matters which concern the common welfare in mundane matters, so also it is the province of ecclesiastical prelates to regulate by precept those matters which affect the common interest of the faithful in their spiritual well-being." That there is any question at all of the relationship between the sacerdotium and the imperium, the spiritual and the secular realms, is a distinctively Christian problem. Ernest Fortin points to what he regards as an important difference on this topic between Islam and Judaism on the one hand and Christianity on the other, writing, "The most distinctive feature of Islam and Judaism is that they both present themselves first and foremost as divinely revealed laws, or as all-inclusive social orders, regulating every segment of men's private and public lives, and precluding from the outset any sphere of activity in which reason could operate independently of the divine law. Christianity, on the other hand, first comes to sight as a faith or as a sacred doctrine, demanding adherence to a set of fundamental beliefs, but otherwise leaving its followers at liberty to organize their social and political lives in accordance with norms and principles that are not specifically religious." This theological legal difference between the theistic religions leads to a socio-political difference as well. Whereas in Jewish society and Islamic society, it seems that there can be at most one center of authority, in Christian society there are two. And one of the most significant and recurrent features of Western history is the tension between these two centers. Each center is relatively independent of the other, but nonetheless has to coexist in the same social space. The upshot, writes Fortin, was that one was usually able to study political phenomena in the light of reason alone, without directly challenging the established religious authority or running the risk of an open confrontation with it. Thomas makes a distinction between two types of rule or governance: regal, or royal, on the one hand, and political on the other, a distinction that will be picked up and used later by Sir John Fortescue. Governance is political when the ruler is limited by the laws of the political community. Governance is regal when the ruler has plenary power. Is a regal government necessarily a tyranny? No. Regal government, though plenary, is limited inasmuch as even though the rulers are not subject to the coercive force of the law, they are subject to its directive force that exercises a guiding authority upon them. Finnis writes, "Holders of even plenary power who demand the obedience of the subject, while themselves defaulting from their own duties under that very law, go beyond the limits of their authority, their rightful power." Our obligation to obey rulers is limited to the extent to which justice requires it. If rulers have no just title to rule, we are not obliged to obey, unless not doing so would cause scandal or some other disproportionate danger. What's the relationship of a ruler to the law? Well, conceptually, a ruler is above the law in the sense that constraining force of law comes from the power of the ruler and no one can constrain himself. He is also above the law in the sense that, if necessary, he may change it or dispense from it. However, the ruler is voluntarily subject to the directive force of the law. Thomas writes, "A ruler is not free from the directive power of the law, but should voluntarily and without constraint fulfill it." A century later, Sir John Fortescue was to make Thomas's distinction between royal and political government the theme of his In Praise of the Laws of England. The tract is written in the form of a dialogue between the Chancellor and the young Prince Edward. It fits into the general genre of the Mirror of Princes literature that was exceptionally common at this time, and even earlier. What's most important about Fortescue's tract is the distinction he draws between royal government and political government. The basic distinction amounts to this. In royal government, the will of the prince is law. In political government, the prince governs in accordance with the law. Fortescue gives a startlingly realistic account of the genesis of royal government. In earlier times, he said, powerful, greedy, and glory-loving men subjugated other men to themselves and forced them to submit to their commands. Over time, these commands acquire the status of law. What of the subjugated? They, preferring the devil they knew rather than the devils they didn't know, eventually acquiesced in this situation. The people thus subject, by long endurance, and as long as they were protected by their subjection against the injuries of others, consented to the dominion of their subduers, thinking it better to be under the government of one, whereby they were protected from others, than to be exposed to the oppressions of all those who wished to attack them. No question of justice here, simply a matter of force and grudging acquiescence. Fortescue doesn't flinch from describing these conquerors as usurpers. So much for royal governance. What of political governance? To understand what Fortescue is up to here, you have to grasp that his account is predicated on an extended analogy between the natural body and the body politic. The use of this figure of speech in this context is not unheard of, but Fortescue uses it with a distinct degree of subtlety. He begins by quoting from St. Augustine's City of God to the effect that, quote, "A people is a group of men united by consent of law and by community of interest. But even though thus united, such people do not constitute a body unless they have a head." Here he recruits the support of Aristotle, quoting him as saying that, "Whensoever one body is constituted out of many, one will rule and the others be ruled." This isn't exactly what Aristotle says, but it's close enough. What Aristotle actually says is, in all things which form a composite whole and which are made up of parts, a distinction between the ruling and the subject element comes to light. The analogy here is simple. As the head is to the body, so is the ruler to those ruled. Nothing very unusual in all this. But things get a little more interesting. The first principle of all living things is, Fortescue says, following Aristotle, the heart. And so, just as the heart, having in itself the blood which it sends forth to all the members, whereby they are quickened and live, so in the body politic, the intention of the people is the first living thing, having in it the blood, namely political provision for the interest of the people, which it transmits to the head and all the members of the body. In Fortescue's bodily analogy, then, the heart and blood are equivalent to the deliberation and consent of the people, as that is communicated to the head. What holds everything together? It is law that binds individuals together and makes them a people. Here, the appropriate bodily item on which the analogy proceeds are the sinews. Fortescue writes, "The law by which a group of men is made into a people resembles the sinews of the physical body. For just as the body is held together by the sinews, so this body mystical is bound together and preserved as one by the law which is derived from the word binding." So, we have the heart, the intention of the people, the sinews, the law binding them together and making them a people, and the head directing the activity of the body for its own good and the good of all its members. Fortescue again. "And just as the head of the physical body is unable to change its sinews or to deny its members proper strength and due nourishment of blood, so a king who is head of the body politic is unable to change the laws of that body or to deprive the same people of their own substance, uninvited or against their wills." The use of the human body as a method of elucidating the nature of politics is an ever-popular strategy, sometimes apposite, sometimes not. What's significant in Fortescue's account is not only his employment of the body-state analogy, but his application of Thomas's royal political rule distinction in a quasi-Machiavellian way. Now back to Thomas. Some commentators on Thomas believe that he went from an early and incautious acceptance of tyrannicide to a mature rejection of it. Early in his career, he seemed to support tyrannicide in certain specific circumstances, namely where the tyrant had achieved his position by violence. However, in De Regimine, he appeared to retract his earlier endorsement of limited tyrannicide, saying it went against Scripture. Finis is not convinced by this, arguing that a textual analysis shows no significant shift of that kind and no particular concern that tyrannicide be done on public authority. Can one ever resist a tyrant? Yes, in certain circumstances, because tyrannical rule is unjust and resistance to it is not sedition. However, where resistance is accompanied by such disorder that it would suffer more harm from resistance than from the continued rule by the tyrant, resistance is not justified. Where resistance to tyranny is legitimate, one may use lethal force. For Thomas, it makes a difference whether a tyrant is someone legitimately entitled to rule but who does so tyrannically, or someone who illegitimately seized power. On the whole, acquiescence and passive disobedience is recommended, with positive action to be taken, if at all, by those with some modicum of public authority. In discussing this matter of resistance by legitimate authorities, Finis instances the assassination plot against Hitler, arguing that Stauffenberg and his co-conspirators constituted a kind of public authority in undertaking their plot. While appreciating Finis's good intentions in making this claim, it's hard to resist seeing it as a spectacular instance of special pleading. A number of comments on this matter of the tyrant and his laws seem called for. First, Thomas's comments on the status of the tyrant's laws are exactly what the libertarian anarchist thinks of the state's laws as a whole, outside and apart from their enforcement of whatever would fall under the non-aggression principle. Second, one can accept the principle of proportionality in resistance, but I can see no principled justification for leaving resistance up to some public authority, although there may well be practical and prudential reasons for so doing. Whether resistance can ever be legitimately offered to one's rulers, and if so by whom, is a theme that will be repeated with variations during the Reformation. What is Thomas's position on self-defense? This is an important question, for, after all, tyrannicide might be thought of as a form of self-defense in extremis. Finis believes that, according to Thomas, there is an exceptionalist moral norm to the effect that I may never choose to kill or harm any human being, innocent or guilty. The obvious objection to this is to ask, what do I do if I'm attacked, either by someone who is vicious or someone who is insane? It turns out, according to such as Finis, that I can use whatever means are reasonably necessary to repel such an attack, even where I can foresee that the employment of such means will result in the death of the attacker, but I must not intend to kill, only to repel the attack. This position appears to be completely untenable. Under normal circumstances, I am taken to intend whatever I can reasonably foresee as the result of my action, so that, if the death of the attacker is reasonably foreseen as the result of the means I take to repel the attack, then I intend his death. However, I do so in an attenuated way. I can intend it without directly desiring it. This can be explained, I think, using Aristotle's distinction between voluntary acts and non-voluntary acts. A ship's captain who throws his cargo overboard in the storm to save the ship and crew acts, properly speaking, voluntarily rather than involuntarily. No one is coercing him to do what he does, or manipulating his limbs, and he can choose not to jettison the cargo if he so wishes. However, his action can be described as non-voluntary, even though properly voluntary, to indicate the fact that, other things being equal, this is not something he would choose to do. His act is not mere caprice. Similarly, a mountain climber who cuts the rope above another climber, where it's reasonably certain that, unless this is done, all the climbers on that rope will fall to their deaths, can be said to intend whatever can reasonably be seen to be the result of that action. He doesn't desire the death of the climber below him and, where things otherwise, would not cut the rope. But things being as they are, he intends what can reasonably be foreseen. Of course, the usual principle of proportionality applies, so that drastic means cannot be employed for the repulsion of a trivial assault or the alleviation of a minor and remote risk. This is a matter of judgment in particular circumstances. Finnis is puzzled by Thomas's apparent disregard of the exceptionalist nature of the moral norm never to intend the death of another when it comes to evaluating the moral status of actions taken by the public authority during a war or in the administration of justice. He is right to be puzzled. If it's exceptionalist, then it's exceptionalist. So either Thomas is being inconsistent or the norm is not in fact exceptionalist. Why one rule for public authorities and another for private persons? Even if a prudential case could be made for confining drastic action to public authorities whenever possible, there will be times when this is simply not possible, as when one comes under attack and there is no opportunity to refer the matter to some public body. Imagine yourself saying, "Just a moment, mugger, while I alert the appropriate public authorities." Moreover, in the end, Thomas himself rejects the claim that imposing and carrying out capital punishment involves no intent to kill. In a footnote, Finnis remarks that if executioners have this intention, so too must the judges on whose orders they act. How can this be so? Thomas's answer is that vicious criminals, having deviated from reason, have acquired the status of a subhuman animal, and so may legitimately be intentionally killed. Not only is this just, but there are consequential reasons for killing them. It deters others and removes a danger from society. The characterization of vicious criminals as subhuman is an act of hermeneutical desperation. However much it may be a relief to our feelings to think in this way, human beings do not cease to be human when they act viciously. In fact, their acts are not vicious unless they are human. Non-human animals may cause death and destruction, but such acts are not vicious. Thomas's justification appears to be nonsensical, as Finnis himself admits. Aquinas' argument that wrongdoing reduces one to the status of beasts, whose life we dispose of for utility, clearly fails, not least because elsewhere he explicitly denies the supposed fact. None of the conceptual juggling by either Thomas or Finnis is necessary if we deny that intentional killing, in the attenuated sense I indicated above, is an exceptionalist norm. What is an exceptionalist norm is intentional murder or manslaughter, namely wrongful killing.